Thank you for coming today. What another exciting moment for the Colby College Museum of Art. My name is Karen Lindy Packman, and I am chair of the museum's Board of Governors. And I'm honored to be standing in front of all of you as we celebrate art and artists who have had and been impacted by and who celebrate the magnificent state of Maine. I would like to thank President Green for his steadfast belief that the museum is a crown jewel of Colby College. Without his support and guidance, we would not be having this celebration today. Our revelry in Maine begins with the museum's opening today of Marston Hartley's Maine, a show co-curated with the Colby College Museum of Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. This show originally opened in March in New York to tremendous reviews and accolades and was seen by wide-ranging audiences, giving them all a new perspective of our Maine. Concurrently on display in the museum is the exhibition Visionary Painting, a show that was curated by Alex Katz, who, like Hartley, has been deeply influenced by Maine as a subject in his art. Maine has also been important to our Cummings Award honoree, David Driskell. This deep connection began with his studies at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in 1953, and with his wife Thelma, he has resided seasonally in Falmouth since 1961. I hope you will have a chance to see the two works by David Driskell currently on view in the museum's Osher Gallery, African Women Windows from 2004 and Blue Pines from 1959, acquired in part through a generous gift with the Alex Katz Foundation. And thank you, Bridget Moore of DC Moore Gallery, for facilitating this acquisition. In a moment, we will have the tremendous pleasure to hear David Driskell in dialogue with the museum's director and chief curator, Sharon Corwin, and learn more about his work and how his time studying and living in Maine has influenced his art. I want to thank you again for coming and celebrating Maine artists, Maine art, and the Colby College Museum of Art. We greatly appreciate all of your support. I would now turn it over to Sharon to begin her conversation with our honoree, David Driskell.
Thank you so much, Karen. What a pleasure it is to be here. And I have to say, this is such a personal thrill for me. I've admired, David, your work for just decades. And to have you here with us, speaking to your many admirers and fans here in the state of Maine just means so much to us. And it's a particular thrill to have two of your pieces on view in the galleries, Blue Pines and African Women Windows. So I hope all of you will get a chance to see those following the lecture or after the luncheon today. Also, such a pleasure to have your wife Thelma with us, your daughter Daverine, and many members of the Driskell family and friends. Thank you, David. Really a tremendous honor to have you here and to be honoring you with the Cummings Award.
My pleasure.
So I thought we would start with the sense of place and home, particularly as we're also celebrating another artist for whom Maine has meant so much. And thinking about your exposure to Maine in 1953 when you first traveled here to attend the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture on a scholarship from Howard University. And then in 1961 when you and Thelma bought a home in Falmouth. It has really been a central part of your life and your artistic practice. Can you talk a bit about Maine and what it's meant to you and your life and your art?
Yes, well, Maine has been a special place for me in many ways. First of all, as a place where I felt welcomed and able to create my own work, to relate to other artists, to meet friends, have relatives come visit. But more importantly, somehow or another, I felt that I had to make myself fit within that great artistic tradition of being part and parcel of that which had been going on for many, many years. I had studied, obviously, the history of the artists who had come to this state, beginning in the 19th century and coming into the 20th. And then I had the good pleasure of meeting a number of prominent artists, as you say, when I came to Skowhegan in 1953. And anecdotally, I went back to Washington and I said to my wife, Thelma, I said, you know, all famous artists go to Maine in the summer. They have summer homes and studios, and Someday we'll have to have a home in Maine. Well, we didn't have a home at that time of our own. We were living with her mother. But as blessings would come our way, I was actually in graduate school at the Catholic University of America there in Washington. And I read the Christian Science Monitor, not so much for the religious content, but there was always a review of artists on the home forum page by a woman by the name of Dorothy Abloh, one of the very, very fine critics. And she was one of the first mainstream American critics that I knew who wrote fairly often about African American artists. Henry O. Tanner, Jacob Lawrence, Romare Bearden, and others. And I would read that commentary religiously, but I would also look at the ads and looking for that summer home. And as I said, as blessings would come our way, we'd saved about $4,000, so we thought we had a treasure chest. And in the paper in 1961, in the spring of 1961, I saw an ad which said, two-room cottage, 6 acres of land, trout brook, pine trees. I was painting pines. And so I thought, oh, wow, I think we may be able to afford this. $5,600. Had never heard of Falmouth, so I looked it up on the map, and I said, well, it's close to Portland. And then it's not that far from Skowhegan. I had been introduced to Colby by our dear friend, Bill Cummings. So, and had been introduced to Bowden. So I knew I was in good company if I were able to do that. So, to make a long story short, we did acquire the property. And it wasn't a cottage, it was really a converted garage. And our aunt drove us up, and this was in August of 1961. And she said, well, you know, it's an interesting place. And I thought, I'm not sure this is what we're looking for, but it had running water and electricity. So I tried to make her decide whether or not we should buy it. She said, no, you're the visionary. You're supposed to be the artist. She said, if you're buying it for what it is, it doesn't have very much to offer. She said, but if you're buying it for what it can be, you may have a gold mine. So that was the beginning. And we paid half of the money down. The gentleman, Mr. Raymond Gooch, we'll never forget him. He said, I'll take you to Freeport, and my lawyer will draw up a contract, and I'll take back the loan. I didn't know what that meant because I'd never had any business deal. But that's how we got to Falmouth.
Wow.
5 years later, we started building the studio and finished it in '67, before we added a room on.
You knew your priorities.
Yes.
So, David, can you talk about that first exposure to Maine and Skowhegan in 1953? What was it like then? I mean, what and your mentors there, Jack Levine and Bill Cummings, and how has that early exposure really influenced your art? And I think particularly about the central motif of the Maine pine in your work. And we're so fortunate to have David's beautiful painting, Blue Pines, from 1959. And it's interesting to me that you really, you're interested in the pine not just as a theme, a kind of subject in your work, which I think has spiritual and symbolic overtones, but really as a formal piece to be the abstraction, the vertical lines of the pine. Was that something you found early on? And again, what was Skowhegan like? I guess I'm asking two questions. But
well, Skowhegan was, I always say it was a special place then, it still is.
Yeah.
I was introduced to the Cummings family. They kind of took me in like I was adopted. Bill and Millie would have me come over to share a meal with them. And I really felt very special because I didn't see other people having that chance. So Skowhegan, the same number of student participants, 65, and they were diverse from all over. Walter Williams and I were the only two African-American students there that summer out of the 65. And but they were students from Europe, from South America, etc. And I felt welcomed into a community of artists, even though I was a student at Howard and the welcome was there and all of that, but it was a totally different atmosphere. And then, of course, meeting the artists who came in as visiting artists. William Zorak, Marguerite Zorak, and an Israeli artist by the name of Rubin. Kuniyoshi was supposed to come that summer, but he passed just prior to coming. And Henry Von Mpoa, his daughter Anne, they were busy with the fresco, and Sidney Simon, and Jack Levine, who spoke very little, but was kind of a critic just by looking at your work. You knew, good, bad, or indifferent. I was the paint assistant. We had a course called Methods and Materials of Painting that Leonard Beaucourt, the paint manufacturer, taught. And I was his assistant because each student participant had a role, a responsibility. And I learned to grind the hand-ground paints and so forth. And I was working at a store in Washington, D.C. at the time called Arts and Crafts. And they sold a brand of paints that I think nobody else was painting with called Sargent. Not a terribly great brand. And so Lenny saw these paints that I used because I brought a whole slew of them up. And he said, that's not a good brand. Why don't you use Beaucourt or Bellini? And so he kind of introduced me to those paints. I'd learned to grind them and so forth. Excuse me. And so he said, if you go back to Washington and tell your boss that you want to introduce my paints, he said, I'll make sure that you don't have to buy any more paints as long as I'm around. Wow. And he kept that promise.
Wow.
I still have Beaucourt paints.
Wow.
In the jar, the Bellini paints and what have you. But to say I was exposed to a different group of people in the arts. One of the participants that summer was Robert Clark, who became Robert Indiana. James McGarrell, Tom Botus, a lot of people who went on to become names of great influence. Alex Katz was over at Lakewood that summer, and I think Lois was over there that summer. Maybe not that summer, but had been to Skowhegan perhaps, had participated, yes. But there was a cadre of artists that I met eventually who kind of accepted me into their company of artists, and I felt so welcomed. And so Skowhegan then became the center for me, and I would come back to visit thereafter. And that relationship ended up with my being first on the Board of Governors, then on the faculty, visiting artists, then as a trustee. And after 50 years, I said it's time for me to move on. But my name is still on as the advisory board. In the meantime, Colby was central in all of that because Bill Cummings was advising the administration about the establishment of a gallery here. And later when Hugh Gorley came, then this was an association that really kind of made me feel as though I was really a part of the whole Maine scene.
Well, we're so glad you are.
Thank you.
David, can you talk a bit about the pine trees and that as a subject? It's something that it's been a part of your art from the very beginning, and you're
Yes.
still returning to it. And what
Yes.
do they mean to you, and why are they still so central to your work?
Yes. There's a painting at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, of the Smithsonian. It's called Behold Thy Son, that I did in 1956. And I thought I was painting in the style of Jack Levine, the kind of chiaroscuro painting, dark to light and so forth. In response to the murder of Emmett Till, and being brought up in the Southern Baptist tradition, biblical references and what have you, my father being a Baptist minister, I knew the Bible fairly well. So I wanted to connect it to that social incident, the illness of the society in that sense, the racism, the segregation, and the deprivation and so forth. And so that painting I did, it was really catharsis for me, of cleansing. And I learned in doing that painting that I could not be a social commentary artist like Jack Levine. And so immediately after that, I started painting pines, the same pines that I had been introduced to in Maine. And I kind of felt like I have a friendship with these trees. Symbolically, the pine tree meant everlasting because it's always green, the spiritual relationship. And so I felt that this was cathartic for me in the sense that I could paint the pine tree and not feel like I was rejected because of race or social association or anything like that. And so the pine kind of became my symbol. As I often say, they don't talk back. They are accepting and kind and generous. And so over the years, this has been a recurring theme in my work. And if you see my studio, it's surrounded by tall pines, 60, 70 feet tall. And so when I look out any direction, when we built our house, almost any direction, you look out and you'll see the pines, the gracefulness of the pines. So they became very important. They still are in that sense.
And there was a moment in the late 60s, early 70s where your work was more overtly politically, socially engaged. And
Indeed.
I love it when this happens. This was the exact work I wanted to mention, but your painting of the I Weep from 1968, and hopefully the next one, which is about to come on, Black Ghetto from around the same moment. And this was really a period of great social strife, and your work responded in turn. But this wasn't a socially engaged art that you really stayed with.
No.
Can you talk a bit about this moment, that moment in history, and how you felt as an artist and the work you did out of it? I will also point out you were doing a kind of collage, assemblage, and your work was pushing, especially with of the I Weep, into a much more abstract idiom.
Yes, the abstract element came in of the I Weep, and I was really kind of coming down from my regrets about the Vietnam War and all of the atrocities that go along with war. I couldn't be a Goya, I couldn't be a Picasso for Guernica or anything like that, but I could make my little statement about this is not what I feel, this is not what I believe we are about. And so there were a series of paintings during that period which addressed the social scene more politically. And I would very often include a black figure, which was somewhat autobiographical and referencing my own interest and outlook. But it's interesting that you would mention of the I Weep because I have never, well, that painting has been exhibited very little because I've always kept it with me. And to a certain extent, I'm still weeping for my country. It touched me in a certain way, and it continues to be with me.
Yeah.
And that perhaps was about as political as I got in that period. My friends would very often say to me, well, you're not painting Black Power images. And, well, how do you respond to that? If you're living a life that is heritably sensibly oriented, you are telling your story. You are part and parcel of what you are in your art. And so I didn't feel that I had to be overtly, always waving the flag.
Right, right. And significantly, you have written a seminal essay called The Evolution of a Black Aesthetic, which was published in 1976 as part of a major exhibition that was organized. You organized it. You were the curator at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. It went to the High. It went to Newark. And it also went to
the Brooklyn and to the Dallas Museum.
And the Dallas Museum of Art. So a major exhibition at that point. And your essay really became a touchstone for many art historians and thinkers following that. In fact, Julie McGee, who's here with us today and who's written so brilliantly on your work, called that a rupture moment in American art history, and I think that's exactly right. But what you were arguing in that essay, well, there were many things. You were historicizing African American art within a continuation of American art, I think offering it a place there, and you were also correcting omissions that had happened within the history. But you were also pointing to the tendency to always read African American art as having to have a political or socially engaged agenda. And at one point you said, regrettably, the artist has been intimidated by the implication that one's art is trivial unless it is politically oriented. And so I think you were offering another alternative, one that your own art has taken, importantly. But can you reflect on that so many years later?
Yes, and it was not an easy stance to take because my artist colleagues, very often, as I said, they would say, well, you're not with it, get with it, Black Power and so forth. Well, I'm living a life of Black Power.
You are.
Because
you are.
I'm the evidence of the African infusion in America.
Right.
And so do I have to always show it in my art? No, not necessarily. There are so many other forms that can do it sometimes better.
Right.
I think the cinema, the poet, so many areas in which that can be addressed. And I had to realize that on my own. I could not be all things to all people in the arts, even though I did spread myself over too many territories. But when I came along, there weren't that many of us who were interested in that infusion of the African American experience in the larger context of American art. And so my professor at Howard University, James A. Porter, who wrote the first major book on African American art, Modern Negro Art. He wrote it as his thesis at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York in 1939, but it was published in 1943 by the Dryden Press. And I was so fortunate to have him as my mentor, my professor at Howard. And he said to me prior to my coming to Skowhegan, he said, you are a good painter, you're going to be a good painter. He said, but you have a good mind, and we need people who can help define the field.
Right.
I didn't know precisely what he meant. I had an idea. And so he said, you have to study history. You have to make sure that you're doing research that brings us along. And so I felt all but anointed, obligated, as though the mantle had been passed to me. And when I took his class, I want to say 1952, Julie would know more precisely, I was the only person in the class And he taught it as though there were 100 people.
Oh my gosh.
Quoting from his book that I had all but memorized. And I think he was very impressed with what I did. Then, of course, I went off to Skowhegan and came back with the accolades of having received the Beaucourt Progress Prize. It made more progress than anybody else. So how could I not be the chosen one? But auxiliary to all of that, much of how I got into the history was really based on my respect for him, respect for Alain Locke. He was not my teacher, but we would go to the lecture hall to hear him once a week in Andrew Rankin Chapel, and other prominent scholars and lecturers. But at that time, Howard was an interesting place in that it wasn't just a black university. People from all walks of life came through. Lois Jones would have Elliot O'Hara come and give demonstrations in our classes. I remember when David Smith came to give a lecture. And it was the kind of exposure that the average student did not get, but Washington was growing, was becoming a major arts center. Then Morris Lewis came to teach at Howard, the only place he ever taught. And there were those kinds of experiences. So I had all of the practical aspect of it behind me. So I had to then, when I left with my bachelor's degree, and I went immediately into college teaching in 1955, I had to continue my study and do research. And so when the time came and I was able and called upon to curate 2 centuries of Black American art in the charge came in 1974 with the exhibition opening in 1976. I felt prepared, but I felt I had to make a strong statement about this is nothing separate and apart from the American art scene. It is there due to the social circumstances of our separating things based on race in this country. But should we let that stop us? No. We know who we are. We're part and parcel of the whole. So what is my sermon, if there's such in all of what I do, is that, yes, we must continue to highlight the accomplishments of African Americans, of women, of Latino people, of Asians, etc., until such time that their work is completely included in the compendium, that they are part and parcel of the American definition. And that was what 2 centuries was about.
Yeah. It's relevant now as it was then. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that brings up you're a renowned scholar, a renowned teacher, a renowned artist. How do these multiple identities intersect for you? Do you feel like they're all one and the same, or do you feel like you put on different hats at different moments?
Well, I never think of separating them, yet they do have separate categories. When I was saying to someone this morning when I went to teach over at the University of Maryland in College Park in 1977, out of that faculty of 46 people, about 22 art historians, 24 studio people, I was the only one teaching art history and studio. And my colleagues kind of, a strange bird, because everybody specialized.
Right.
And I shall never forget that there were some questions about the legitimacy of a subject such as African American art being integrated into the mainstream curriculum of American art. And my chairman, Dr. George Levitine, who was born in Russia, trained in Paris, and educated at Harvard, pointed out, he said, this is an important aspect of American art, and we have to recognize it. And he was instrumental in kind of helping the faculty feel at ease with my being able to dabble in both areas. And so we became a center then where students came not only to study it on the undergraduate level, but later on the master's level and then on the PhD level. And we started producing good, competent scholars, some of whom are still out there. And some, of course, took my place when I left. And so this whole notion of being able to inculcate all of this or to bring all of these things together, it was part and parcel of the HBCU tradition, the historically black college and university tradition, because you couldn't get a job at most HBCUs unless you could teach several things, because sometimes you were the only art teacher. When I went to Talladega in 1955 and succeeded an artist by the name of Claude Clark. And so they said, can you teach art history and humanities? I said, yes. And I had minored in art history at Howard. Can you teach printmaking? Yes. Can you teach drawing and painting? Yes. Can you teach ceramics? Yes, although I hadn't had a course. So I got my books out and stayed a bit ahead of the students. Developed a liking for ceramics that then got me involved in the chemistry of glazes and things of that nature. And so sometimes when you have to do those things, you do them. But I'm so happy that I did. So I brought that experience to Maryland, and then I brought the course that Lenny Bocour had introduced me to at Skowhegan, Methods and Materials of Painting. And I'm sure we were one of the few universities teaching fresco painting and caustics, egg tempera, and so forth. And my colleagues and we was able to limit the class to no more than 10 students. And my colleagues would always say, are you still teaching that luxury course? So, but it all fitted in, and I was trying to wear all of those hats, yes, at one time. And they didn't always fit me well, but my family was tolerant of my moving about and doing this and collecting, and as I said, along the way, sometimes robbing out 2 daughters of milk to buy art.
Well, this actually is another thing I want to talk to you about, because you have amassed in decades one of the great collections. And it started out at Howard University. Professor James Herring gave you and Thelma a Kandinsky print as a wedding gift.
Yes.
What a very nice wedding gift.
Yeah.
But you have gone on, and my sense is that at Howard, your mentors there really instilled in you the importance of collecting.
Yes.
And what the responsibility of the collector is. Can you talk a bit about that, what you took from them and how you approach your collecting and your collection?
Well, I would, Howard was a fairly large university in those days, but it was small enough for the teachers to still have a personal relationship with students. And we would go to our teachers' homes, to Porter's home, to Lois Jones, we call her Miss Jones, and we'd see that they would have other artists work on the walls and so forth. And my notion was, I want to live like this. I want to be able to enjoy other artists like this. And they would very often say, you must train your eye to see what is good. And Lois in particular, she would always, she'd say that, but she wanted you to buy hers too. But she was a sweet person, and she was the person who insisted that I be sent to Skowhegan, because I think somebody else was in the making and so forth. And Lois stood up and said, no, has to be David.
Wow.
She had a friendship with Bill Cummings when he was stationed over at Fort Myer outside of Washington in Virginia. And he told her that he was going to establish this school when he returned to Maine. And they stayed in touch. And that's how Howard became one of the first schools to have a scholarship.
That's great.
At Skowhegan. And the first person from Howard to go was a gentleman who is 94 years old now. Well, he's not too far ahead of me. I'm 86. By the name of James McMillan. And he's still painting in Greensboro, North Carolina. Yeah. So it was that kind of relationship of seeing they collected. Professor Herring had a rather large collection, very Catholic in his taste. And my wife and I and our two daughters lived in that house for a while at the Barnett Aiden Gallery. And so we kind of patterned our system of collecting when we could afford it on that. And while I was a student at Howard University in 1952, working at the Barnett Aiden Gallery, Mr. Duncan Phillips came to visit Mr. Herring to look at the Theodore Stamos show. And I met him. And I started going to the Phillips for concerts and whatever. I felt so welcome. It was like a home. You'd see a Rembrandt, a Renoir, a Cézanne, and then you'd see a little still life by his wife, Marjorie Phillips, beside it as you go up the stairs and so forth. And it was like, this is how one should live with art. Yeah. It's not that precious. Don't touch it, but live with it. And so I came up in that atmosphere of wanting to have that kind of relationship. And as I said, my family was tolerant of my buying a few pieces here and there. And the most important thing was our teachers were saying, you must have a good eye. Train your eye to see. And later on, of course, I adopted that little book that Joshua Taylor wrote, Learning to Look, for my students. And I think I was informed by so much of that, but also listening and looking to what they had said and given us. And someone was saying to me about the story of my collecting a Rembrandt print in Copenhagen in 1964. I had been studying Dutch art down at Rijksbureau Kunsthistorisches in The Hague that summer. And my desire was, I must find a Rembrandt print. And I have a friend from the museum there in Copenhagen. She said, oh, David, please, forget it. So I would go out to little shops, and I collected maybe 50 or 60 prints and drawings from the Nuremberg Chronicle, the Albrecht Dürer, William of Worms, and a whole slew of things that you could buy then for $10 in kind of like junk shop. And so when we got to Copenhagen, I was walking down Kierkegaard, Church Street, was visiting Walter Williams, who had been my roommate at Skowhegan in 1964. And I saw this work in the window that I thought was a restrike. And I went in and asked the gentleman, I said, is this a restrike? He said, no, it's a facsimile. And I'm a professor at Howard University and never heard the word facsimile. So I said, oh, what is a facsimile? He said, it's a very fine reproduction. So I said, may I take it outside and look at it? And he said, sure. Took it out, and I saw it was the real thing. It was an etching. So I came back in, and I said, well, how much is it? And he said, $10. And I then became an expert on facsimiles. I said, $10 for a facsimile? He said, but sir, it's a very fine reproduction. So I paid him that $10 and dashed out. I called Miriam up and said, I have my Rembrandt. She said, oh, please, David. She said, well, bring it over to the museum. She was curator of prints and drawings. And took it over. And they took it to the lab. And the gentleman said, it's a better impression than the one we have. So
Wow.
I attribute some of that to Joshua Taylor, learning to look.
Right.
And also the training that my teachers gave me of observing. And they would also say, if you want people to buy your art, you should buy theirs.
Yeah. Right.
So.
Right. Well, speaking of prints, you have had an extraordinary career as a printmaker. It's been an incredibly important medium to you. You have great facility across all media, it seems, but printmaking seems to have a special place in your oeuvre. And the way in which you approach it is quite unique. You have a very painterly way of approaching the print. And it was actually, if I'm right, the first art class you took was with Professor James Wells at Howard, was printmaking. So it was kind of a foundational skill for you. And I think it's Ruth Fine talked about when she looks at your prints, she sees you trying to impose painting onto printmaking, which we can see that in some of the images we're looking at. But can you talk a bit more about your work as a printmaker and how you see it fitting in within the rest of your art?
Well, you know, it's interesting you asked that because for years, I never considered myself a printmaker. I would just make prints in between, never show them. Off and on, I'd make a print. I still have blocks, lino blocks, wood blocks that I carved in the 1960s and 70s that I never editioned. And Professor Holton, Curly Holton, who's director of the Driskell Center now at the University of Maryland, is a very fine print master printer and artist. And he would always give me materials. He's, Japanese blocks and so forth and so on. And I'd go out and find a piece of wood that was half rotten and with all the textures and what have you, and I'd carve into that. And he said, we can't put that on the press. It's going to mess up the press, carve on this. Well, there was this affinity for found objects that I love to incorporate. So the printmaking, I started with the traditional method, but as Ruth says, to me it really was like an arm of my painting. And the early ones, I didn't have a master printer, no one printed for me, so I would do the Japanese method of spooning it, working with Japanese paper and what have you, and so I'd have a very limited edition of how those prints were done. But I never really considered myself a printmaker until perhaps close to the year 2000, when Adrian Charles and Dr. Steele, who at that time was director of the Driskell Center, said, we'd really like to do a print show. And I thought, well, I don't have enough. But we started collecting them and collecting them and collecting them, and then they added up to a rather large repository. So the process for me has been creative and inventive in certain ways. I want to see the texture of the paint. I want to feel it. And in certain aspects, I want to tell a story. They are usually narrative in that sense. And they kind of take me back sometimes to my childhood through biblical stories or the African influence through my teachers, Professor Porter, and folk like that.
Right. Well, I could ask questions all day long. This is such a pleasure and such a delight. But I think we'll open it up if there are a few questions from our audience. I'm sure people have them. And I know we have mics traveling around. So if you can wait a moment for a microphone to get to you.
Hello. One of the things... Oh, should I say it? All right. One of the things that strikes me as I look at the art above is the breadth of the multiculturalism. You have a reference to Benin, the one about traveling to South Africa. You have the shaker chair and quilt. It's a pretty wide spectrum, as you alluded to earlier. You also said that an early piece of yours was about Emmett Till. I have sort of a two-part question. First, talk about the multiculturalism, how you survey such a wide territory, and then how that relates to, another famous Emmett Till painting was Dana Schultz's at the Whitney Biennial that caused quite a bit of controversy because it was a white woman painting a picture of a really traumatic experience in a group that was not her own necessarily. But you've talked about trying to erase those boundaries and see the totality of the American art scene, et cetera. So can you just sort of speak on that topic, the multiculturalism, how you see yourself transcending those cultural boundaries?
Yes, well, for me, as a teacher, I always felt it was my duty, my responsibility to challenge my students to see above and beyond the ordinary. I would very often play devil's advocate about things in the class just to see where they're thinking beyond what they read in the text. And but I wanted them to understand that art, for me, has this spiritual place in our lives. It takes us to another domain, another dimension. It is, Romare, the psychologist writer, says that when artists get into their craft and get involved with it, they must realize they are competing with the angels. The sensibility of being above and beyond the ordinary. Otherwise, we'd all be artists, and I often say, well, think of what the world would be like without the vision of the artist. Dull, dull, dull. And that sensibility which the artist brings. So for me, I think there's another dimension beyond the natural order of things. So you challenge your students, you challenge the viewer to see it beyond what you see in nature, perhaps, or in the natural world, and you bring your own vision. And that vision is very often conditioned by your social experiences, your living experiences. And the multicultural aspect of it is somewhat wishful thinking, but it's also real in the sense that we don't live in a world of boundaries. We have created the boundaries that separate us, but I don't think that was a part of the great Creator's plan. Our free will gives us a chance to move beyond that. And so art moves us beyond that, for me at least. So my notion of trying to extend that vision beyond the ordinary is what I think we do when we see outside of race, when we see outside of class, when we see outside of our usual domain. And so for me, it's been important to embrace all of these subjects. And no one person has ownership of that. It's floating up there, in the words of Plato, in the realm of perfection. And it's up to you to pull it out and bring it into existence. And that's what the artist does. through causation. And so I have no tolerance for those who feel that they own the subject by themselves, regardless of race. We are human beings, and we should embrace it from the point of view of our human good. And I know there's a time for protest. I participated in protests. I lived in Alabama during a trying time in the 50s, the governorship of George Wallace. And the little campus of Talladega College, where the Klan would come through, occasionally just shooting indiscriminately to scare people. Things like that. But I recall being in Charlotte, North Carolina in 2002, and our exhibition Narratives, which came to Colby, was at the Mint Museum. And it was a young man who obviously had not had a great deal of information about history. He knew I grew up about 40 or 50 miles up in Appalachia in the mountains from there. He said, "What was it like when you were a kid coming to the Mint Museum? And now your collection is here." And I said, "No, in those days, African Americans couldn't come to the Mint Museum." He said, "What do you mean? You didn't have transportation?" No, we didn't have the racial quotient, so to speak. So he had never read about that. He was an NPR person and so forth. And, no reflection on. Let's just say he was young. So I said, no, history. And then I told him, I said, well, there was a time when they decided they would improve the situation. So once a week, they had what they call Negro Day. And we'd be loaded up in the buses and go. And but he had never heard any of that. So I had to educate him, had to give him a little lesson in history. And he said, well, aren't you angry? I said, no, why should I be angry? I'm very privileged. I'm sitting here talking to you. I'm teaching you. And and I told him about, I said, I attended a one-room school through elementary school, and then I attended a four-room high school in the hills of Appalachia over in Rutherford County, North Carolina. And I said, I had to ride 35 miles every day on this bus going to school. I had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to get on the bus to go to school. And my parents said the way out of this, in the sense of the poverty that the sociologists told us we were living in, we didn't believe them, and I still don't, because we were spiritually and greatly informed about things. I passed 5 wonderful high school edifices along the way. I couldn't attend because of my color. Beautiful structures. I got to Forest City, a facility of about 30 or 40 rooms for the white students. And he said, but why shouldn't you be angry? I said, because it's my demeanor. I was taught differently. And I said, my father used to always say, you don't brag, you don't brag. But I said, in the high school across town, Cool Spring, the white students went, I said to him, I said, you know what? I said, I shouldn't be complaining. I said, I have a presidential medal, but I don't know anybody from Cool Springs who has one.
Another question? Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you for everything you've done for American culture and connecting us to the rest of the world. It seems a tricky thing to do these days. But I have a question which is sort of, it's based on an observation, and I want to see if I'm on the right track. Mm-hmm. So in your work, there's a lot of diasporic logic. Mm-hmm. You know, we see sort of African figures in Catholic settings, for example. But there's a balance of several things that happens in your work, and the diasporic logic makes it very dynamic. So even like your paintings of pines, for example, you pointed out you collected a Dürer, and people might know Dürer as the guy who paints every single piece of hair on a rabbit. But with a tree like that, you cannot paint every needle on a pine tree. So what happens is there's a combination of the look, the aesthetic, but the cultural shorthand. And the idea is that we have to be able to recognize that as a tree, or that as a tree. That's a little harder. But the idea is that, so there's painting culture, there's social culture, and there's style, there's your own particular approach. There is the literalism, but for us to be able to read it, you're talking to us. And so that shorthand, the idea of tree, so there's language, which is sort of a secular thing, it's communicating. There's your personal role, your personal style, there's the culture of painting, and then there's the spiritual content. And it seems that to use sort of the fundamental diasporic logic of your work, it's always shifting. I mean, first of all, is that accurate? And do you think those things are in motion, and do they balance? And would you mind, like, specifically talking about the pines? Because, whatever, I grew up here, I'm a Maine boy, and those pieces are really moving to me. And I'm just wondering, like, what's the breadth of, like, what's the cultural engagement? What's the painterly engagement? I mean, this was a great set because you can see cubism and all the other stuff. But if you wouldn't mind commenting on that, because, gosh, I've seen a lot of paintings of trees, and none move me like yours do.
Yeah. Thank you, Danny. For me, I don't want the art to be static in any form or fashion. So I'm trying, as you said, and I think you are on target, I try and draw from so many different sources so that it isn't static, it's moving. I have been informed by so many different cultures. I've been informed, my art has been informed by so many masters, and one of the great masters of collage, Romare Bearden. I happen to have had his tutelage, been a dear friend, of letters of exchange and advice that he gave me about painting. My first one-person show in New York, my dealer's here, Bridget Moore from D.C. Moore Gallery, and my first show supposedly was in 1980 down in the East Village. And there was a painting that I did. It was just kind of major in the sense that I was paying homage to Romare Bearden. And he came in and he saw the painting and he said, "I'm very delighted that you did this." He said, "But I want you to seek your own voice." Now, only a friend would tell you that. And there was another little painting where I had torn the collage instead of cutting it and so forth. And he went over to it and he said, "I'm going to buy this one." And he said, "That's you, because you are using the medium and you're expressing it through yourself." And it was a real lesson in learning for me. And in relation to what you're saying, I'm looking out, I would cut out the figures, African masks, and bring in things from other cultures and put them all together in the sense of a diasporic notion. But I was trying to keep in mind that this is the fullness of life. This is the total experience, that I'm not isolated. I'm part and parcel of the whole. So I think you've explained it perhaps better than I could. Well, as a writer, of course you would. And but the influences, I don't think, you don't stand before the canvas and say, "Today I shall do so and so, and so. Tomorrow I shall do so." It comes with you in the sense of a kind of spiritual flow. You may have to erase it. You may have to go back and start all over again. But it's that kind of conglomerate of making, of shifting, of sharing of ideas that contributes toward the whole. And very often people say, "Well, how do you know you're finished?" Well, you really don't. At least that's mine. You don't always know. I remember Walter Williams told a story about Philip Evergood that he had studied with, and it said whenever Philip Evergood came into the Brooklyn, into the Whitney, they would assign a guard to follow him around because he'd have little tubes of paint. and one of his painting that needed a little touching up, so you don't have to worry. I'm not going to do that to New Times. And shake a chair, which is at Bowdoin, yes. You know, artists are never, well, you know, you don't reach the realm of perfection in art. You're forever seeking. Otherwise, you wouldn't be an artist.
Right.
There'd be nothing to, you know, to pursue.
Right. Well,
So I didn't answer your question, but you know what, Danny, you know, I say to people when I don't answer the question properly, I say, well, at 86, I say what I want to say.
David, thank you.
Thank you.
What an absolute pleasure. And I would say you almost reached the realm of perfection. Such a pleasure and such a joy. And Barbara, do you have one last question for us?
I do, but it's
Yeah.
Really, and I hope that I'm not speaking out of turn when I say that I think I'm speaking for the entire audience when I say that in the last hour I've been so tremendously moved. I've had tears in my eyes. I've laughed along with everyone else. I've had goosebumps. And I've learned so much, and I'm hoping, Sharon, that you and your staff could post both a video of this incredible moment, as well as Mr. Driskell's essay,
Yes.
Identities, onto the museum's website, The Lantern, so that we can share this with other people who are not here.
We can indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you.